I'm Kathy Angelo, moderator for the Amateur Music Network's upcoming piano series with Paul Hirsch. And I'm meeting today with Christopher Basso, who's one of the four artists featured in the series. AMN founder Lolly Lewis and I wanted to give a behind the scenes introduction to the artists. Thank you, Chris, for being part of this exciting series.
Thank you for having me.
For those of us who have worked with Paul Hirsch at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, lessons with him would often entail a passionate discussion to explore the meaning of the music beyond the notes on the page. Chris, how long have you worked with Paul and studied with him?
Oh, um, I don't recall my musical life without Paul in it.
Oh, that's pretty amazing.
I did my undergraduate studies at the conservatory starting in 1978, which is when I first met Paul. I didn't study with him privately at that time, but I did take. I remember taking everything I could that was being led by Paul Hirsch. His words and his insights into the music has stayed with me over all of these years, and even in my own teaching today, I find myself harking back to things that I've learned from Paul. Elements in the music I look for as a result of studying with him. I left San Francisco and went to New York for 20 years, but I came back in 2002 and to get my master's degree, sort of a long roundabout. And of course, I knew Paul and studied with him then. And again, I think for musicians in the Bay Area, Paul is pretty central to that musical life. Not only for pianists, but for string players, because Paul is in that unique position where here's a pianist who's also a violist, and so who sees music and is exposed to music that playing music that pianists we can only dream of. So he adds insight also from a string player's point of view, which is more rare with pianists. I don't know. I don't know any other pianist that actually plays professionally plays another instrument. You know, so yeah, Paul. Yeah, he's been central to my musical life.
And many generations.
Yeah, exactly.
Selecting repertoire for this series and knowing Paul's insight to the Beethoven sonatas, we definitely wanted to include a discussion on one of the late piano sonatas. Christopher's going to open the series with the third movement of Beethoven's Piano Sonata 109. So I have to ask you, Chris, to tell us about your relationship with Beethoven, in particular this sonata. How long have you played it, and how has your interpretation changed over the years?
I first It's funny, and I think you were at the conservatory during this time as well. But when I was, it must have been 1979, I think, when Paul us gave a concert series of all the Beethoven sonatas. So I was at that time, I don't know, 19, 20 years old, and it became there was my exposure to many of those Beethoven sonatas. There's 32 of them. I knew the famous ones, the Waldstein, the Appassionata, the Moonlight. But here we had an opportunity to, over a period of, I believe it was 3 months, he gave a series of all Beethoven cycle, and that became my exposure to many of the Beethoven sonatas, including Opus 109. And yeah, I remember hearing that third movement. I'd never heard anything like it. And I've studied the piece on and on and off for over 4 decades, and every time I come back to it, um, there's new insights, new things to be discovered. Um, you never finish a piece.
Right.
That's the great thing with music, is that it's a living thing, and every time I've come back to it, there's been something else that I've picked up on.
Maybe because you've changed, or as we grow, we
Exactly.
have different perspectives, especially if you've put it down and haven't played it for a few years and you come back, you see a whole different.
Exactly. I've probably come back to the piece in that time, um, 4 times probably. I would say every 10 years. Now this one's interesting because I did play. Paul gave a lecture a few years ago on late Beethoven, and I did play, amongst other things, the entire Opus 109. Um, and so when I was asked to do the third movement, at first I thought to myself, well, I did it like 2.5 years ago, but I'm so glad to be doing it again because uh, I I think I skimped the last time I picked it up, and I think I was rushed, and I probably wasn't as happy as I could have been, and I think I can speak for Paul as well. It I just didn't give it enough time, and so I'm grateful to be able to um, pull the third movement out again, and I've been looking at it, and I've discovered many things that I probably was resting on the fact that I've played it over the decades and that it's in my fingers, but these pieces require so much more than just what's in your fingers, and I'm discovering lots of new insights as I've been studying the score these past weeks. Um,
Have you ever seen Andres Schiff's discussion masterclass on 109?
um, Not on 109, although I've seen some of his lectures on some of the other Beethoven sonatas. I'll have to look for that because I didn't know that he had a lecture on 109.
Well, he talks about that third movement. It's as one of his favorite um, human variations or favorite movement of all time. And when it comes back to that theme at the end,
I remember that.
as hopefully there's the only response an audience could give to that would be silence. Don't break that spell
Yeah.
it has created. I found that really interesting.
Yeah, the first thing that struck me when I heard that, again, I had never heard it before, and so when that theme comes back at the end of the variations, one of the first things I thought of was the Bach Goldberg variations, because the aria comes back at the end, and I can't help but think that Beethoven was tipping his hat to Bach in that moment. Those variations go through such a transformation that by the time you get back to that theme, um, everything has changed. We're changed, and it's not simply a restating of the theme again. It's it's a different. The piece has transformed, and it is a different.
And taken everyone on a journey. So when you come back to where we started, it kind of does full circle, but in a completely different way.
Exactly. Some of the variations, it's through such transformations that it's very, very, very hard to hear the theme within it.
Right.
He really takes it through a whole series of transformations. And I still, even as I'm working on it now, I'm I'm hearing more and more about where the theme is going and how it's going. But even having studied the piece, there are times that that it's so disguised that
And probably intentional.
I think so. Oh yeah, yeah.
In there somewhere.
A remarkable set of variations. They're all so very, very different than the others. Often variations will sort of organically grow out of the preceding um, variation, but with Beethoven, it is these six very, very different textural variations.
Right. The other amazing thing with Beethoven is that he was working on all three of those late sonatas almost at the same time.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's you find motifs that run through all three of them, as you do in Schubert's last three sonatas, which he also was working on simultaneously. Um, and yeah, also the form of them, these late sonatas, is so um, unusual given the usual structure of a sonata form. The first two movements of this sonata, in total, the first two movements equal less than half of the length of the third movement. The third movement is a set of variations. That's not something you usually see either.
Right. Right. Yeah.
In the last sonata, Opus 111, the two movements sonata, the last movement is also a set of variations. Um, he used that form a lot. These sonatas were the last piano sonatas he wrote. However, he did write one of the most magnificent sets of variations, the Diabelli variations, after Opus 109, 110, and 111. Yeah, it's a form he goes to a lot in his in later in his life.
The one thing spoke briefly the other day, and one thing you mentioned about Paul and his depth of understanding of late Beethoven. Um, Explain what you mean by that. That Paul, why Paul specifically?
Paul Paul has a. It's funny when you ask to describe the sonata. It's really hard to talk about that. You know, like, oh, what does the sonata mean? Um, I I don't have good words for that. It's hard for me to put in words what the piece means. Um, yeah, I wish I Paul has a very good way of explaining in words. I'm not a. I wish I was a poet or something. You know.
Well, that's
Uh,
Paul's, humanist approach to music teaching. I mean, it influences all of us that have worked with him, or even just being around him. That he has that connection, finds the connection in even beyond musical meaning.
yeah, I always remember Paul. One thing he would a lot during lessons would he uses the term tracking, where throughout a piece, no matter what's happening around it, there's a thread that is running through the piece that you sort of want to keep the listener, um,
Engaged. Yeah.
uh, tethered to, so that the listener, amongst all of this stuff that's going on in the music, can still sort of zero in on this thread that is running through and is keeping the listener engaged. And I think that's powerful, and I think it's something that with everything I play, I'm trying to um, think from the listener's point of view also.
Right. Right.
Um, and because if I can't keep the thread going, and if I can't keep it going, then I doubt the listener
Right.
is going to be able to
Exactly.
follow along. And so that's something that, um, whatever I'm playing, it's in my mind is where are we going here and
Right.
what's going what's important. Um, and I think the variations are a very good example of um, very good example of trying to find the thread within the music. Um, and these are things, you know, yeah.
Paul
Every,
often has an interesting response to listening to someone play. And he jokingly says, well, I wasn't bored. So if he's bored, he's lost that thread, or the player has lost the thread, more importantly.
I always knew during lessons when I was losing him because I would hear the pages turning like back. And so I always knew like he was either looking back at something or looking at. But it was funny. It happened every once in a while, not all the time, but sometimes and uh, that's it's funny during lessons. I would always think, uh oh, he's I'm losing I'm losing him here. I have to tell you. Particularly when I did my undergraduate study, I was uh, I was incredibly intimidated playing for Paul, and I still get nervous playing for him, which I love. That I still have that I care enough that that um, that he can still do that.
Right. Well, I
Uh,
think we all were intimidated. I remember one of the first sessions I had with him. um, I think it was Schumann, and we got, I think, in an hour and a half, we'd gotten through four measures. And I went away from it having learned a ton, of course, but I thought at this rate, it's going to take me years to get through this piece.
I've
But
had exactly
so
the
much of
same
what
thing.
he said and what we worked on applied elsewhere in the piece. But I just thought four measures in an hour and a half, that shows you the depth that
Exactly.
he would go to.
Right. I mean, it was in that like sculpting of just a phrase. Um, that sort of took you along for the rest of the piece because I mean you can apply it might not be the same thing, it might be a
Right.
totally different phrase, but you start looking at all the phrases that way. You're delving into it, you're delving into the sound, you're delving into voicing.
Yep.
uh, Again, when I talk about that thread, where where's it going, and um, that I mean that has been a source, a real source of inspiration. Just his talking about these things or dealing with just a phrase, sculpting it, tapering off the end of the phrase, and it seems, or it can seem excessive, or a little fussy. It's not at
But
all.
it's not, though.
Not
It's what it takes to really shape it and find that meaning.
Yeah. The older I get, the harder I realize what a hard instrument piano is
Right.
to
That's why
play.
his background as a string player brings so much to finding the line and the linear approach. Because, as pianists, we don't necessarily think that way.
Exactly. I mean, unfortunately, with piano, the moment you hit the key, there's no
Right.
place to go but down, and so while a string player can easily sustain a tone and crescendo on a tone or vibrato, um, pianists have to find other ways of doing that. And Paul being a string player and having played all of those Beethoven quartets, also, as a violist, he has a way. Yeah, he has a way. Um, Paul has a sound also at the piano that I always aspired to.
Right. Yeah.
Uh, and I think it's what keeps us going. as pianists or musicians in general, I still go and play for Paul. He when I was doing my graduate studies, we were required to take, it was a half a credit, um, piano forum, which was you're required to take 2 semesters of it. I ended up taking 4 semesters of it because it was my absolute favorite um, class at the conservatory, and it's where all the pianists sit in a you know sit in the auditorium or large whatever large setting, to allow for a lot of pianists, and the faculty would be there, piano faculty, and it was a 2-hour class. 3 pianists would play each week, and then would go around the room. People would give some input, and then one faculty member would coach us on the piece. Um, and it was so inspirational that Paul decided. So, in addition to piano for him, he had a studio class one day at the conservatory, for his studio, and then on Saturday mornings, every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock, would be up in Mill Valley, and would have another studio class from 10 to 12, which they still have, and it's not on Saturdays anymore, but on Wednesdays,
Yeah.
and I've been to a few of those, and it just, even though it's been years since I was a student, doing my master, I did my master's from 2002 to 2004. That's when I came back to San Francisco from New York, and it was only supposed to be for 2 years, and I ended up staying. It'll be 20 years next month. Um, the studio class still goes on, and it really, I think it's something very important. I think it's important for pianists to continue playing for each other, and
Absolutely. Yeah.
again, you never finish learning.
Never. Never.
Yes,
A lifelong journey.
yes, it
You know,
really is.
you're on the piano faculty of the San Francisco Community Music Center, and I'm sure you also have an independent teaching studio. How do you engage and nurture artistic expression and emotional content with your students?
It's funny. I teach a whole array of students, from really beginners, to some very advanced adult players, to adult beginners, and this is where I've come to realize, I take for granted how hard it is to play the piano because I've been doing it my whole life. But you're asking adults or children to simultaneously, play 2 hands. One is in a treble clef, the other is in a bass clef. You've got to negotiate your fingerings, and you've got to play the correct key, and you have to read the correct note, and you have to do all of these things simultaneously. And often, the student gets frustrated. I still get frustrated, when I'm learning, learning the notes. Like I'll have students say, "Oh, I'm just really so frustrated learning the notes," and
Yeah.
I get frustrated learning the notes. That's learning the notes is the
Just the beginning.
is it, you know. It's after that, and it's actually once you get over the hurdle of playing the notes that you can really, for a lot of them, you can really start delving into the music, and then the practicing becomes fun. And I try with my students for them to make sure that they're having fun with what they're doing. Yes, it is frustrating, but it's frustrating for everybody. So let's get over that
Yeah.
and just deal with that, because once that's over, time and time again, the students are like, "Oh, it's so much fun to practice this now," and they can really start. So with my students, I mean, I try to keep it simple. I really do, and it's not always simple what they're doing. Trying to negotiate and coordinate the hands and the choreography between the hands. Um, but I love seeing the students, their satisfaction when they get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, I've got a lot of students, and I can't teach. I do not teach any two of them exactly the same. And that's important. Is to be flexible enough that um, that you can switch it up depending on the student.
Right, right. Well, everyone operates differently, so
Right.
you have to be adaptable and flexible.
Right. Exactly.
Um, this piano conversation on Beethoven's music will continue in much greater depth, we hope, with Paul and Christopher on Wednesday, April 20 at 5:30. Please join AMN for a revealing, insightful conversation as how musicians find meaning in their playing. Chris, thank you so much for meeting with me today, and I really look forward to continuing this conversation on Beethoven, especially.
It's my pleasure, Kathy.